Okay.
Or should I?
Okay.
Would I give the money?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. So we're going to get ready to start our forum in 2 minutes. Well, let's see, a minute. Well, nope, we're down to 40-something seconds. And we're going to get ready to start our forum. And you are more than welcome to do some book purchases, continue to make book purchases for a little bit. And then afterwards, Mark will be glad to also continue signing and supporting book purchases. But I'm just wanted to introduce him. I'm so glad that he has come to join us today and to talk about this topic of Christian nationalism. And we are grateful for his presence today and for his academic contribution, as well as his spiritual contribution to our lives and to our wider community. So, Mark, whenever you are ready, no pressure.
All right.
You go ahead. The mic is yours.
All right. All right. Talk amongst yourself. Maybe I should just jump in while I have a minute. First thing I want to tell you before I do anything else, the price of this book was never $38. I wouldn't pay $38 for this book. The list was $28, but it's easier for making change and so forth, and I'm just glad to be here. So $25 today. Yes.
Kindle is $9.99.
Well, right. That's the electronic version. Yeah. If you want print, if you want to hold it in your hand and write things in the margins. Yeah. I'm old school. Work the extra money. Okay. Let me just get another swig here.
Check to you?
Me.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity, and this is my chance to say publicly thank you to Eric, who was one of my readers when I first completed the manuscript, the first draft. I asked 5 people to read this book and give me their feedback. Eric was one of them. And chapter 10 in the book, which is on the history of African American spirituality in the historic black church, is a whole lot better than it was, because Eric introduced me to a wealth of scholarship that I did not know anything about. So thank you, Eric, for your contribution. Now, I want you to know as well, though, that as a result of the feedback I got from those people, I did rework several sections of the book. And when it was picked up for publication, the publisher, Smith and Hellwis, did not make any substantive changes. Only stylistic ones. And I think that's a credit to how seriously my readers took their role. All that editing work was pretty much done. One thing that the publisher did change, however, immediately was the subtitle. My original subtitle was boring, if accurate. It was simply A Theology for the Renewal of American Christianity. And Keith Gammons, the chief editor at Smith & Hellwis, told me before I had even signed a contract that he had no problem with my main title, Fully Free, but the subtitle needed to change so that search engines could find it. He said the word racism needs to be in there, and maybe Christian nationalism too. So we went back and forth about a new subtitle and settled on one that I think has a nice cadence to it. It's the 3 R's. Rejecting racism, renouncing Christian nationalism, and renewing American Christianity. And of course, Keith was right, because at least so far, people are drawn to this book, not because of the main title, but because of the subtitle. They see those words, racism and Christian nationalism, and say, oh, this should be good. I just want to make clear, because I don't want to be accused of false advertising, that I did not set out to write the definitive book on racism and Christianity or on Christian nationalism. My purpose, as the original subtitle indicated, was to provide a theological basis for renewing Christianity in the United States of America. And it is my contention, and I come back to this again and again throughout the book, it's my contention that we cannot really renew American Christianity without rejecting racism and renouncing Christian nationalism. Now, why is that? I don't want to give away the whole book, but I'll give you an idea. I doubt that many people will disagree with me that Christianity in America is in critical need of renewal. Just about every expression of the faith is in serious decline. Meaningful renewal is not a matter of updating strategies for outreach. Our problem runs much deeper than public image. What we need is a complete theological reformation. This is a very uncomfortable truth that a lot of people just don't want to talk about. But the dominant religious impulses in American Christianity, I'm not talking about particular denominations or traditions, but the dominant religious impulses that tend to be reflected in those various traditions when they flourish in this country are shaped by European theological developments that, on the one hand, racialized humanity, and on the other hand, undermined the church's role of speaking truth to power in a prophetic way. Western racism is rooted in Christian theology, bad Christian theology that has nothing to do with Jesus, but Christian nonetheless. The whole purpose of stratifying humanity into races based on skin color was to provide a Christian theological basis for the slave trade. That theology was widely repudiated in Europe by the late 18th century, but it took deeper root in the Americas than it ever had in Europe because the American economy became increasingly dependent on slavery. Now you might say, well, when we ended slavery, we got rid of that bad theology. No, we didn't. That bad theology has continued to operate in very subtle ways in American Christian culture and has undergirded systemic racial discrimination that still, as you know, has not been totally dismantled. So until we deal honestly with the racism that is embedded in American Christianity, we are never going to find the renewal that we seek. Christian nationalism springs from the very same theology. It's hardly a new cultural phenomenon. It's in resurgence today, but it has been with us in one form or another since before the American Revolution. Christian nationalism springs from the heresy that light-skinned people more perfectly reflect the light of Christ and are therefore destined to triumph over all human culture. The form of Christianity that Christian nationalists advocate, even if they don't understand it and won't admit it, is a racist, triumphalistic perversion of the gospel. Added to this toxic theology is another European theological development that is rooted in the work of St. Anselm and reached full flower in early Protestant orthodoxy. You'll have to read how this happens, but Anselm shifted the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection away from defeating the power of evil at work in human hearts and human institutions and toward appeasing the wrath of God. Following Anselm's lead, Protestant theologians repackaged the gospel as a contractual arrangement between God and individual human beings. This wooden understanding of atonement completely obscured the communal and prophetic elements of the gospel message. On the basis of what came to be known, maybe you know this term, penal substitutionary atonement theory, creative American theologians in the 19th century argued that Christianity has everything to do with personal faith and morality and absolutely nothing to do with social justice. Now, at the same time, there were many Christian social activists who rejected that privatization of the gospel. They wanted to transform American society, principally by abolishing slavery. But even many of those progressives, we might call them, who sought social change, were still operating out of a racialized, triumphalistic version of the faith, which is why most white abolitionists did not favor racial equality. The book is entitled Fully Free. It explores the theme of freedom because that is the animating ideal of the United States of America, and it also is a very important theme of the Scriptures. There's an introduction that you really need to read. Don't be one of those people who says, oh, I don't need to read the introduction. That's not important. Yes, it is. It's why the introduction begins on page 1 and not page lowercase Roman numeral 1. It is part of the text. That's where you find out why I did this and how I'm doing it. Then, part 1 traces the theme of freedom in the Bible. It's entitled Freeing Onesimus. How many of you know who Onesimus was? Well, a few. So the rest of you will learn something right there in chapter 1. Onesimus was an escaped slave who sought and received refuge from the Apostle Paul. And his story and the story of his enslaver, Philemon, who was a friend of Paul, really provide the linchpin that holds this whole book together. I return to the story at the end of chapter 1 and then again at the end of the book. In part 1, I explore what Paul meant by the phrase freedom in Christ. I've been doing a lot of scholarship on Paul for a long time, and I'm convinced that one of the things we need to understand about him was that he was not a Christian, because Christianity didn't exist at that time. He was a reformist Jewish rabbi, engaging in a lot of creative midrash on the Torah. And his concept of freedom in Christ is not some radical break from the law of Moses, like I was taught at one time. For him, it is the true fulfillment of the law of Moses, as interpreted by the prophets and embodied in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So, part 1 explores the full meaning of Paul's phrase, freedom in Christ. Part 2 is entitled Freeing America and is focused on 2 questions. The first, how does the theme of freedom in Christ speak to the American ideal of freedom? And in this section, I identify 2 dominant religious impulses. I'll let you find out what they are. One of them split before the Civil War over the issue of slavery, but those 2 branches still in many ways resembled each other. One of these dominant impulses leads to the triumph of Christianity over the culture, even to the point of creating a Christian state. The other results in the continual capitulation of Christianity to the culture. Neither one of those is very satisfactory, and neither one represents the biblical understanding of freedom. Both are beholden to a lot of unhealthy theology that emerged during the colonial era and really had a huge impact on how people in this country learned to read the Bible. Now, well, all that leads to the second question. Where in American Christianity do we find authentic expression of the biblical theme of freedom? I believe it is found in a powerful way in what has never been a dominant tradition, but may be the most American of all Christian traditions, and that's the historic black church. And I want you to know that the focus and the shape of this book is inspired by many long theological conversations with black pastors right here in Syracuse. The book actually ends with a proposal for how we can start doing theology again in a way that is inspired by the historic black church. Up until early 2022, I was a local church pastor. I served 4 churches over a period of 4 decades. And for the last 30 years, I've taught religion and theology at Lemoyne College. Throughout my career, I have sought to balance pastoral sensitivity and scholarly integrity. I hope I've done that, both in the pulpit as well as in the college classroom. Now I've tried to do it again in this book. There is a lot of scholarship here, but I didn't write this book just to be discussed by career academics in a scholarly way. I want this book to be read in churches. I want it to be read by local church pastors and by Christian lay people who've never had a seminary education, but who take their Christian faith seriously, like you folks, many of you folks. My hope is that this book will generate sacred conversation, which to my mind is what theology is, sacred conversation. I hope it'll prompt practicing Christians in this country to reimagine how our faith can transcend our political divisions and provide a healing, hopeful, and clear message to our troubled nation. I'm happy to sell you books. I want you to know, did I tell you this already? Yeah, I did, didn't I? The original price is not $38. It's $28, but you can have it for $25, and I'll be happy to sign the book. And before we have a line form, I'll be happy to entertain any questions anybody has. Yes?
This is from really early in the beginning of what you're saying. This is from early in the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about that Americans kind of accepted the slavery context, but Europeans were already kind of railing against it. Well, where had it originated from for them to rail against it in the first place?
Why did they rail against it in the first
Well,
place?
no, who originated it?
Oh, the whole idea. It
Yeah.
goes all the way back to the 15th century in Portugal. Yeah, it was the Portuguese explorations, which then became a slave trade very quickly, when that theology first developed. And I think I do make reference to a particular theologian who kind of did that work. You may have heard of Annius of Verbo. Maybe not, but I bet you have heard of that horrible theology about the curse of Ham. That was developed in the 15th century. And so all along, it was about, and one of the tragedies about this is my problem. I go way off topic here, but one of the tragedies is that when Christianity was first flourishing, it was a multi-continent phenomenon. Christianity was flourishing in Africa as well as in Europe. And then there was this incursion from the Umayyad dynasty in Syria that pretty much got rid of all the churches in northern Africa and split African Christianity from European Christianity. And the folks in Africa really struggled to survive. But from that point on, it became a purely European kind of faith, and that's the way we think of it. And so when Europeans began to explore and find people who didn't look like them and really didn't have any explanation for why they looked so different, and then began to think about how that could be exploited. But I should say that even then, there was already a theology at work of triumphalism that could easily be transferred to this particular situation. So it's got really old roots.
Okay, thanks.
Long answer, sorry. I'll try to be better.
That was good.
Can you explain the cover art of the book?
Explain the cover.
Is there any
Well,
symbolism in there that...
this is not my cover. I mean, I approved it, but what was really important was to make clear that we're talking about we're talking about Christianity in the United States, so the use of red, white, and blue was important. Also wanted to have a prominent cross to make sure people understood it was really about Christianity. I think those are the only two artistic. Do you see something else there?
I was analyzing the ratio of red to blue and look.
Oh gosh, don't do that. Don't do that. I will tell you that we went through several different covers. That was hard. And what made these covers hard was that it's hard to somehow visually represent these subjects without creating an image that looks like you're pushing what it is you're critiquing. It looks like something that, Tucker Carlson would publish. So this is a much more simplified cover than some of the ones that we considered using. There's nothing about the red-blue ratio, though. Anyone else?
Has he invited you on his program yet?
I wouldn't accept.
You mentioned that you've talked with many of the black pastors in the area.
Yeah.
Are they interested in what you're talking about and see this is a way that might be followed?
Okay, first of all, many might be an overstatement. I developed some very close relationships with a number of black pastors, but the black church is as much in crisis as the rest of us. So there are a lot of questions being asked about the role of the black church in society, and why they are experiencing an exodus of younger adults, just like all the rest of us. The ones that I had conversation with, absolutely, are interested in these kinds of dialogues. And one of the things that we came back to again and again is how difficult just plain old racial dialogue is, My wife is very involved in the Interreligious Council, and she's been a convener of racial dialogues. That is just so hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because white people are really impatient and don't want to listen. They want to get on to action and wind up doing things that aren't helpful because they haven't listened to understand what the problem is. But what I and these other pastors have noted is that if we come into a dialogue saying from the very beginning that we share the same faith, we've already got something in common. We start there. We have to have a basis to talk because we all say that we believe in Jesus. I mean, just start there. And when you're just doing kind of a secular racial dialogue, it's tough to find anything to hook onto to start talking. So it's my hope, it's my belief, it's been my experience actually, that when I step into a majority black congregation and say certain things from the pulpit, and they're all very welcome to talk to me. They're anxious to talk to me after church because I'm speaking their language, which happens to be mine too. So we who are in the Christian faith in this country have a leg up when it comes to this kind of dialogue. And I think we ought to take advantage of it. Does that answer your question? I should say there are probably many black pastors who don't have any interest in this at all. But I know that there are some who do.
You had a % interest, problem solved.
Well, yeah.
The question I have is how do we transfer it from an urban
Good question.
Entity into the rural?
Uh-huh.
I had a minister friend who was doing a doctorate in Wesley, and they were asking about ethnicity, about empowerment, and 98% were white.
Yeah.
And try to encourage that. And I'm look at trying to bridge the change.
That's a really important point, and this is easier to do if you live in a densely populated area. You don't have to go as far to find a church that has a different demographic than your own. You go out into rural America, and it looks like everybody is white. First of all, that's probably actually not true. I think you're going to have to drive farther than 20 minutes, but I bet if you did as a white rural church, I bet you could find a small town within an hour, or there are really good black farmers in this country, They're out there, and I presume they have a place to worship. So I wouldn't just dismiss the possibility. But let me use that as an opportunity to say that this has to be done very carefully, Again, I don't think we should rush to the dialogue. I think a good way to start is to have pastor-to-pastor conversations. And when that relationship develops, then it's easier for the pastors of each of those churches to go back to their congregations and say, what about doing something together? And you also have to be careful that your particular congregation is going to be able to have a better conversation with certain black churches and not other black churches. So you have to be careful about all of those things. But I understand this is a problem that when it comes to just racism generally, folks in rural churches who are feeling pressure from their denominations to address racism are saying, well, how are we going to do that? Because there are no black people out here. There probably are somewhere. You just haven't looked for them. There's another piece to that. In the last chapter, I just make very brief reference to this, how a lot of the systemic problems that have perpetuated racism in this country have also oppressed a lot of poor white people in rural areas. William Barber, you know William Barber? He's really onto this. He's written a book called White Poverty. And his understanding of the Poor People's Campaign, which had started by Martin Luther King, and then it kind of got shoveled after his assassination. Barber has picked up the Poor People's Campaign, and King said publicly, he wrote this. In fact, there's a quotation in the book of where he said it, that if we address these problems of systemic racism, there's no way we're not going to raise up poor rural white people in this country. And it is a terrible thing that in the years of Reconstruction, poor whites and freed blacks didn't find each other. Can you imagine how different the whole history of this country would have been? But the reason they didn't find each other is because more powerful interests were telling those poor white folks, all you've got is that you're white. And so they drove a wedge between them, wouldn't allow them to realize their common interests. Long answer again, sorry. Yes, sir.
I want to go back to your previous answer when you spoke of our common faith gives us common ground on which to begin these conversations.
Okay.
What happens when we look at the fact we live in a multi-faith country? And how do we carry out those conversations in a productive way that allows each of us to come from different corners, but to meet at the same place?
Well, that's harder to do. It's not impossible. And I guess that's sort of outside the bounds of what I was trying to address in this book, honestly. I really am pretty singularly focused on Christianity in America. That is not to say that there are not other faith traditions that are important that need to have a voice in this culture, but I'm speaking out of the Christian experience, and I'm seeing that connection. But, I take your point that when you move from simply ecumenical dialogue to true interfaith dialogue, it's more complicated.
And then, so it's almost 12 o'clock, and we know what happens after 12. Everybody starts to slowly filter out. So Dawn is going to ask us get the last question in, and I'm sure you might be able to ask other questions as Mark is signing your book or as you're preparing to depart. But I do want to just, after Dawn, let us transition to formally end our forum. And then it would be a big help for us and our partners with the Syracuse Gay and Lesbian Chorus if we could help take the tables down. People have some time to help take tables down. That would be appreciated. So they can come ease their way in and be able to rehearse tomorrow night. So Dawn, you have the last word.
That's pressure. I don't know exactly how to articulate it, but can you give us specific examples of, say, how Christian nationalism is stating policy or cultural specifics?
Who's the superintendent of schools in the state of Oklahoma? Have you followed this story? He is a self-described Christian nationalist. And when people say, this is Christian nationalism you're pushing, he says, yes, it is, and I'm proud of it. And what he has done as the superintendent of schools in Oklahoma is mandate that the Ten Commandments be posted prominently on the walls of every school classroom, and that the Bible be the first lesson of the day in every public school classroom. Charlie Kirk. You know the name Charlie Kirk? This guy is dangerous. He is a Christian nationalist. He is proud of it. He is leading a series of revivals all across this country of people who are saying, this is not a democracy. It was never intended to be a democracy. It was intended to be a Christian state. And we have to do everything we can to make sure that happens. So they say we're a republic, and then interpret the word republic to give them the permission to actually put their version of Christianity in a status position in the country. Now, that's just two examples. I could give you General Flynn. I don't remember his first name. Also, a very proud Christian nationalist. And this is exactly the same kind of message that he is portraying. And in many of these churches that have bought into Christian nationalism, they're hearing this on Sunday morning. Don't listen to these people who try to tell you the United States is a democracy. It is not. It is a republic. And the whole point is for us to become a Christian state. Those are a lot of people who vote. And in that kind of environment, you do what your pastor tells you to do. Mm-hmm. Very much one. Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you.